Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to church this morning. If you need sermon notes or pens, you can raise your hand. Those of you watching online, you could raise your hand too, but the notes are at a speed. No one's going to do anything for you, but we'll just kind of go from there. So we're in part 4 of our series on wisdom, and I just called this Wise Up. And what we're talking about today, we're just talking about anger. And what I'm talking about is the danger of anger. And so I'm going to start off with just a quick question here. Do you know your anger quota? Okay? And I'll explain what I mean by that. Your anger quota it's this thing, everyone has this point, this threshold. Whatever you want to call it, if the right buttons are hit, you kind of explode, or you kind of get mad, or you start to growl. That's your AQ, or your anger quota. Think of it this way. Let's say that you're approaching an express checkout lane in a grocery store, and it's like quite obvious that you're supposed to have 15 items or less in your cart. You guys with me on this? And you know you got 14. You got 14 items. But you walk in and you're looking for that guy in front of you, and you know he's got more. You expect everyone else to have less than 15, but you begin to look and see there are people who don't have. They have more than 15. And so you're expecting kind of to find this cheater, and you're looking, and here's the problem. The first part, stage 1 of anger, is this: you're looking for the negative. You're looking to find somebody doing something wrong. So you approach the express lane, and there in front of you is obviously a guy who's got 17 items. And so inside, on the outside, you're smiling, but inside, you're starting to boil. Can I get an amen with anybody? Because you're in what we call the express lane. You're not here to be waiting for a long time. That's why you came here. So the guy's taking advantage of the system. And so then you start thinking about these things, and then you get to stage 2. And here's stage 2. Stage 2 is you begin to coddle, and you begin to entertain these negative thoughts. What are you going to say? What are you going to do? You got an evil eye on this person. You're kind of passively, aggressively giving them the cold shoulder. You may express a friendly smile to them, but inside, you know you're sure. How do I know this? I remember distinctly this happened when I was on vacation one time, and someone in front of me had like 17 bottles of wine. And so I'm waiting behind him, and then they looked at me and said, I'm sorry, I didn't know I was in the express lane. And in my mind, I'm like, you are just straight up lying right now. You know where you're at. So then when you have that, here's what happens. You get to stage 3. Here's stage 3. You have the negative add up. So think of it this way. You've had other aggravating things happen, and this is the end of your day, and you're trying to get home, and work was bad, and you have all this stuff just piling up on you. You're in this area now where you're ready to explode. You're ready to really say something because there's too many items in this particular area. So stage 3 kind of feels good if you think about it, because you really want to say something, but deep down you know that it's the wrong thing. Now here's what's interesting about getting anger, losing your cool, yelling or screaming, cursing, whatever it is. It's also a very unhealthy experience. According to Dr. Radford Williams, a Duke University researcher, he says all 3 stages of anger can damage your health, but in particular, stage 3 is the worst. One study in anger in young men, and this points to young men a lot because of testosterone levels and things like that, they were more prone to outbreaks of anger. They were 7 times more likely, though, people who did that consistently, to have heart disease and die at a very young age because of that anger. In other words, anger is deadly. And so you have to be careful of it. It's scary, too. It's frightening to find yourself losing your temper in the middle of a situation and then going back and say, how did that happen? And so anger has to be managed, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So we'll just do kind of a topical thing in Proverbs, and this is kind of a deep dive into anger, and I'll explain how we go about this, what it looks like, and then how to overcome it. So if you guys would, stand with me. We're just going to read a couple of different verses, one from James and one from Proverbs, and we'll read these together. Let's start off with this one from Proverbs. It is better to be slow-tempered than famous. It is better to have self-control than to control an army. Here's what James says. James says this, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. You guys can be seated. And I'm going to explain something. When we do like topical sermons, when we look at a particular subject matter, a particular behavior, you have to remember something. And I talk about New Covenant realities all the time. And what the New Covenant does, it focuses on the gospel and not on the situation. And if you go back to, as we teach through books of the Bible, what you notice with Paul, he always gives us identity first, who we are, and then he tells us what to do. And you see this over and over and over again. Here's the problem. When I highlight anger, which is sinful, it can be very sinful. There's a verse in 1 Corinthians 15:56. I don't have it on the screen, but I want you to listen to what it says. It says, the sting of death is sin, but here's the part I want you to hear. And the power of sin is the law. And so here's what that means. That means when you say, hey, don't be angry, that is I'm making a law for you. And what I'm doing with that law, I am empowering your anger. Do you understand what I'm saying? You don't really. Okay, I'll explain it in a different way. Give you a picture here. Please do not throw rocks into the pond, okay? That's a law, right? It's something not to do. That's picture number one. Here's the pond. If you look, there are rocks in the pond. So someone saw that, and that empowered them to say, hey, I'm going to throw that in there. Now, they may have came back and said, don't throw rocks in the pond after the fact, but the point is this, don't touch the wet paint. What do? That is what happens. That's how we're wired, and that's what law does. Law empowers sin. Does that make sense? It's really important to understand that, because if I focus on trying to fix myself, I'll never be able to do it. If I focus on fixing my anger, then I don't need a savior. The point I want to make is this. We're going to look at some things. You're going to see some things in yourself, but we always look back to Jesus to fix our problems. Amen? All right, so let's dig in. The first thing with your anger, first thing I want you to look at is just consider your anger. That's the first thing. Just consider it. And here's what James says. James says, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Just underline that part. Take note of this. And here's what he's saying. Consider the cost of your anger. Consider what it costs. When you get angry, what are the consequences of that anger? In Proverbs 29:22, let's read this one together. A hot-tempered man gets into all kinds of trouble. Look at Proverbs 15:18. Let's read this one. Hot tempers cause arguments. Here's another one that you can just draw from that. Anger causes mistakes. Classic example. As you guys know, I'm always dealing with neighbors. I got neighbors in my gym area. I got neighbors in my home area. And I have all kinds of things going on. Well, last week there was, the week before, they're working on the house next door, and they're the worst general foremans I've ever seen. They just hire the worst people. Anyway, all day long they are beating on stuff. They're making noises. They're throwing trash everywhere. And I'm watching my grandson at the end of the day, and I look out the window, and I see someone taking their trash, and it was a lady putting it into my trash can. Now, I've had this before because we have squatters. You guys know that on the other side. So I've dealt with that. I actually yelled at the lady, to be honest with you. So I'm holding my grandson, looking out the window. I'm saying, Maddie, let me give you lesson number one in life. You got to know how to protect your trash can. So I opened the back door and I said, hey, what are you doing? And this lady looks at me and she goes, oh, I was just taking the trash out from next door. This was the nice neighbor. It wasn't the bad neighbor. And I shamed her so bad. I totally apologize. But once again, I got irritated. I got angry, and anger causes mistakes. People with hot tempers can do foolish things. Will Rogers said this, people who fly into a rage seldom make a good landing. right? And Will Rogers was the guy that said, I never met a man I didn't like. Do you guys know that famous quote? If I ever saw him, I'd say, Will, you not met my neighbors. That's So when you lose your temper, you always lose. You lose more than you temper. You actually lose a lot of respect. You can lose your health. You can lose your job. You can lose your family over this. In Proverbs 11:29, let's read this one together. The fool who provokes his family to anger and resentment will finally have nothing worthwhile left. And so he said, you have to be careful in how you deal with your anger. One day, Alexander the Great, in a fit of rage, struck his favorite general. He hit him and he killed him, and it was his best friend. And he cried out, he said, I've conquered the world, but I can't even conquer my own soul. So that anger has to be controlled. There's an article in James Dobson magazine years ago, and it was the title was When You Feel Like Screaming. And they took a survey of 9 to 12-year-olds and asked them 2 questions. What do you like most about your mother, and what do you dislike most about your mother? All the answers to the first question varied. The answer to the second question was unanimous. Almost every child used the phrase on the second question, what do I like least or what bothers me the most, was her screaming. I can't stand it when she screams. And here's the question, why do we scream? Why do we lose our temper? Because it works. There's a short-term effect to screaming at people. Psychologists know this. When you yell and you get angry at someone, most of the time people will comply simply out of fear. But in the long run, you lose because anger alienates. No one wants to be around anyone who is constantly flying off the handle. It just alienates people. It's too stressful for people to be around it. It always causes negative effects. Here's the second thing in your notes. When it comes to anger, I contemplate. In the 19th verse, the second part of it, it says, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. So in this, you just get these just direct imperatives on how to act. I'm supposed to listen first. I'm supposed to speak slow, and I'm supposed to be slow to anger. And so here's what he's saying. Don't respond impulsively. Think it through first. I'm so glad I'm teaching this because I have a confrontation I have to have this week with someone. It's just going to be one of those things where you have to talk to someone, and my initial reaction is to be super aggressive with it because it's a violation of a boundary. However, after thinking about Proverbs, these things really do matter, and I look at it from the perspective of how can I make this conversation happen, yet still have a win for both parties. It's not always easy, but you can do it. So you have to really kind of control and think about what you're doing. In Proverbs 29:11, it says, a stupid man gives free rein to his anger. A wise man waits and lets it grow cool. And so if you're thinking about this, if you wait, that's the key to it. One of the great remedies for anger is simply to delay. The longer you hold your temper, the more it improves. But once again, this takes practice because a lot of people are impulsive and their first response is to become angry and say the first thing that comes out of your mouth. They don't use the filter. Thomas Jefferson is the guy who said, when you're angry, you count to 10. When you're very angry, you count to 100. And he said, if you're still angry, you just keep on counting. And so there's just a lot that you have to deal with this. And some of you think that, like anger is difficult, but the truth about anger really is a choice. It's a choice that we make, and I can prove it. Let's say that you're having an argument with your son or your daughter or your spouse, and the argument is super heated, and then the phone rings, and you pick up the phone, you go, hey, how are you? Right? It's a choice. You can control your anger in the middle of that, and you can stop that yelling and screaming. Proverbs 12:16, here's what it says. Let's read it. When a fool is annoyed, he quickly lets it be known. Smart people will ignore an insult. For some people, everything is life or death. For some people, they want to just respond. But honestly, the depths of your character are shown by how you react or respond to certain situations. When someone wrongs you, Here's what it says in Proverbs 19:11. Let's read it. When someone wrongs you, it is a great virtue to ignore it, not to react immediately to that, not to take an insult. Maturity is the ability to overlook a hurt. Maturity is the ability to disregard that word that comes at you, to shrug it off and to play it down. Once again, the whole point of this message today is this: nothing can make you mad. You choose. You choose to be mad. You get a choice in the middle of that. You can't blame anything or anyone. If you put two people in the same situation together, one gets mad over a circumstance and the other one doesn't. Why? Because it's a choice. So when you're irritated, there's a few questions to ask yourself. Here's the first one. Is this really a big deal? That's the first question. And then the second question is it worth being upset over? And you need to ask yourself, is it worth giving up my joy and my peace for? That's really what it comes down to. There is a book, and it's called Patton's Principles for Managers Who Mean It. And it's General George Patton. And one of the laws of the book is this: never fight a battle where you don't gain anything by winning. There are a lot of battles you can win, but is it worth it? And will you gain anything in the middle of that? Knowing what battles to fight and what battles not to fight, that's really wise. That's wisdom. Proverbs 17:27. Those who are sure of themselves do not talk all the time. People who stay calm have real insight. So the more you understand this, the better you'll be. Now, let's look at the whys. Why do we get angry? In your notes, here's the first one. First reason we get angry is because we're hurt. We're in pain. And pain causes anger. Physical pain, emotional, spiritual, all these things get you angry. When you hit your thumb with a hammer, you get angry because it hurts. Listen, temper is one thing you can't get rid of by losing it. Here's the second thing: frustration. Another reason we get angry is we're frustrated. Nothing seems to work. Things don't just go as planned. There's a movie called Anger Management from years ago, and one of the guys is named Dr. Buddy Rydell, and here's what he says. He's talking to this guy named Dave, and he says, "Dave, I'm going to explain something to you. There are two kinds of angry people in this world. There's explosive and implosive. Explosive is the kind of individual you see screaming at the cashier for not taking their coupons. He says implosive is the cashier who remains quiet day after day and finally shoots everyone in the store. He says, Dave, you're the cashier. And Dave responds, he says, no, I'm the guy in the frozen food section dialing 911 because I'm afraid. And so frustration is a really big part of that. Here's the next one. The next one is insecurity. When you're threatened, when you're afraid, when your self-worth is attacked, that causes anger. When you're backed into a corner, when you think that someone's violating you, my needs aren't being met. And then here's the final one. The final one is stress. And I think this is the most important one because stress is kind of like a warning light. And whenever I'm under stress, it means I've kind of taken my eyes off of what's important. I've taken my eyes off of the Lord. It means that I've started looking at something else. It means I'm looking at this particular circumstance rather than looking at the Lord. And so here's what I mean by that. And I'm sure you guys can relate to this somewhat, but there are things that will come your way that'll irritate you, that'll get you angry. Do you find that in those situations, you begin to play those things again and again and again in your mind? Does everybody kind of go through that when you have this troubling situation? And then you create an idea of how you're going to fix that because you're going to go to this person, you're going to confront that situation, and you're going to say this, and they're going to say this, and then you're brilliantly going to end the argument with this one great line. Is it just me, or does everybody else think that way? So we're always fighting those particular battles, right? But really what that is just self-reliance, and in the middle of that, if I can take my eyes off of that and then turn it over to the Lord, when I get to the conversation, the conversation's totally different because it never comes out the way that you think it's going to come out. But what I save myself is a ton of stress by trusting the Lord all the way up to that conversation. Does that make sense? So I'm just looking to the Lord to fix that particular problem before I even get to it. And it's just having reverence for the Lord. In Proverbs, it says, reverence for God adds hours to each day. And when I'm meditating on the wrong stuff, it takes time away from what's important to me. So here, let me give you the next one. Another reason we deal with anger is because of control. James 1:20 says this, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. And so what we learn to do with our anger is we learn to control our anger. In Proverbs 21:23, let's read it together. If you want to stay out of trouble, be careful what you say. I read this quote, blowing your stack only creates air pollution. Another one I read that I thought was pretty good, a sharp tongue is the quickest way to cut your own throat. And so some people have that, and some people are, like I said, impulsive, but they have very sharp tongues, and it's very, very dangerous. And so the problem with words and the problems with the things that we say when we're angry, they cause so many problems. They cause so much harm for other people. In Proverbs 51, it gives us the antidote. And let's read it. A gentle answer quiets anger, but a harsh one stirs it up. And there's another principle in this verse. Anger is contagious. The more angry you are, you'll give it to other people. If you get around people who are angry, you'll feel that come off on you. And so if someone's continually angry at you, eventually you're going to get angry at them. It's simply contagious. It's a well-known fact that children learn from the models that they observe. And I talk about this all the time. Behavior is caught more than it's taught. Behavior our children see our examples of our behavior. We can say all the things we want to say, but they'll do the things that they see. And we kind of know that. Children learn from the models that they observe. There's a famous golfer, his name was Tommy Volt. And one day he was at a pro clinic and he had his 14-year-old son with him. And he thought he'd show off. So he said, hey, son, show them what I taught you. So his son immediately pulled out a 9-iron club and tossed it into the sky because he had seen his father do that. So let me give you 3 don'ts with your anger, and then I'll give you what to do with your anger, okay? Here's the first one. Don't store your anger. And what I mean by that, don't store it up inside. Don't suppress that anger. So I don't store my anger. Think of it this way. What's inside of you will come out, okay? And it's kind of like this. If you take a bottle of soda and you shake it up and you let it go, it's going to overflow because there's stuff in there that comes out. So for us, it's like if I continue to stuff that anger, eventually it'll come out. It's called suppressed anger. And a lot of times when you have suppressed anger, what it turns into, what's called misdirected anger. And so what you do is you get mad at people who didn't even do anything to you, but because you're angry, you direct that anger at that person because it's a safe place. It's usually a spouse. Does that make sense? So sometimes when people are angry at you, they're really not angry at you. You're just a safe place that they can vent. In your notes, number 2 is this: don't stuff it. So I don't store it, I don't save it up, and then I don't stuff it. I don't deny that it's there. And there's a lot of people who get depressed, but a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times that depression comes from stuffing the anger. And then here's the last one: don't spill your anger. And what I mean by that is don't express your anger in inappropriate ways by flying off the handle, by just screaming and hollering, being sarcastic, manipulating, all those types of things. Just remember, what's inside of you will always come out. So let's look at what do we do? What do we do with our anger? And these are not in your notes. I just have them on the screen because there's several things I want you to look at. The first thing is this: I acknowledge my anger. I I identify it as a problem. I recognize it. I admit it. I face that. And here's what Ephesians 4:26 says. Let's read it. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry. So you acknowledge your anger, but acknowledging anger doesn't mean that anger in itself is sinful, because it's not. It's what we do with it. So what I do is I acknowledge it, I confess it, I realize that I have an actual anger issue, or I have an actual anger problem. So I don't just admit the anger, I also admit the cause. I tell God, you know what, God, I am frustrated, I'm angry, and here's why I'm angry. I feel threatened. I feel fearful. Listen, I joke about this neighborhood stuff that I'm dealing with, but it's an issue. I sometimes feel very, very vulnerable, even fearful in the middle of that, because my area is being violated. It doesn't feel safe at that particular point. And so that causes me irritation. That causes me to get angry, and I have to deal with that appropriately. And so here's another thought on that too. You may have grown up in a home where people communicate through just screaming and yelling at others. I don't know if you guys ever been around that kind of a situation, but that's how some people communicate. That's a learned behavior. That behavior can be unlearned. Any behavior that's learned can be unlearned. Here's the second thing. The first thing is I acknowledge it. And then the second thing is I bring it to God. I seek God's help. I bring my anger to God in prayer, and I ask for his wisdom and strength how to handle it. In Philippians 4:6-7, here's what it says. Not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, that's a situation of anger, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Read the rest with me. And the peace of God, which passes transcends all understanding. I'm sorry, I better put it on the screen so you can read it. Let's do it again. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And so what I do is I seek God's help in that. I encourage the Lord to help me. I put that request in my daily journal. See, the thing about anger is this: it's not constant. It creeps up every now and then in different areas, and sometimes it hits you when you least expect it. And so you have to have God's Spirit help you in the middle of that. You have to trust that his peace will guard your heart and mind. Here's the next one. I practice self-control. Proverbs 29:11, fools give vent to their rage, but the wise bring calm in the end. And so self-control is my responsibility to handling my anger. Listen, the more that you allow anger to happen, the more that you give into it, the easier it is to give into it again. And then it becomes a pattern. Anger, rage is addicting. It sends signals to your brain, and it becomes an addiction. And some people will constantly fly off in a rage because they're addicted to that anger. It's the only way they know how to respond. Here's the next one, and this is the last one. I renew my mind. In Romans 12:2, let's read it together. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So we're to, once again, this goes along with practicing self-control. These are the things that are our responsibility to follow through with. We pray, but then we act. Sometimes we're the answer to our own prayer. So remember, dealing with anger, it's a process, and it's okay to seek support, to get help from other people, to have friends that help you stay accountable in the middle of it. Just remember, God's grace is sufficient, and he's helping us in the middle of what we're dealing with. Let me close with one short story. It was in the spring of 1894. The Baltimore Orioles came to Boston to play a routine baseball game. But what happened that day was anything but routine. The Orioles' John McGraw got into a fight with the Boston Red Sox third baseman. Within minutes, all the players from both teams had joined in the brawl. The warfare quickly spread to the grandstands. Among the fans, the conflict went from bad to worst. Someone set fire to the stands and the entire ballpark burned to the ground. Not only that, the fire spread to 107 other Boston buildings as well. And it started with just two guys being angry and getting into a battle in the middle of it, and it ended up in a disaster. Let's close our eyes and let's pray together this morning. God, we're thankful for your word, and your word tells us it's better to be slow-tempered than to be famous. It's better to have self-control than to control an army. So God, as we examine ourselves, and I know there's a lot as we look at this, there's a lot of things that come to our mind. And sometimes it's frustrating because we can't seem to overcome these things. But Lord, here's what your word says. Your word says that when we're born again, when we ask Jesus into our heart, you give us the fruit of the Spirit. And the fruit of the Spirit is love, it's joy, it's peace, it's patience, it's kindness, it's goodness, it's faithfulness, it's gentleness, it's self-control. That's who we are. That's by the power of your Spirit who you give us, how you give us an identity. So Lord, that peace and that kindness and that faithfulness and that gentleness, let that come out of us when we're faced with these situations. Let your Spirit guide us and lead us. God, help us not to impulsively respond to things, but to be slow to speak, to be quick to listen, to be slow to anger. So God, I pray today for those who are struggling in this particular area, struggling in this area, this low-level area of anger. No one even sees what's going on, but behind the scenes, there's just this seething anger, this boiling point that people are struggling with. So God, expose that in us. Help us overcome that. Help us to let that out of us in appropriate ways. Now, if you're here this morning, you're watching online, and you've never taken the step for that fruit of the Spirit to enter into, you can do that right where you are. Just say, Jesus, come into my heart. I trust you right here. I trust you with my life. I know that you died for my sins, and I don't know that you are alive to this day. So come live in me. It's in Jesus' name I pray. And everyone said,